That's the way I like it. 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 When you take me by the hand, tell me I'm your loving girl. When you give me all your love, and do it, babe, the very best you can. That's the way I like it. 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 When I get to be in your arms, when we all alone, when you whisper in my ear, when you turn me on, that's the way I like it. That's the way I like it. And that's the way I like it. 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 That's the
operator. This is Nashi from Soul Palace. Can you connect me to my baby on Mars Flight 247? Thank you so much.
Hi darling, how you doing? Hey baby, were you sleeping? Oh, I'm sorry, but I've been really missing you. Hi darling, how's the weather? Say baby, is that cold better now? Oh, I'm sorry, is there someone there with you? Oh, since you went away, there's nothing going right. I just can't sleep alone at night. I'm not ashamed to say I badly need a friend. Oh, it's the end. Now, when I look at the clouds across the moon, in the night I just hope and pray that soon. Oh, baby, you hurry home to me. Hi, darling. The kids say they love you. Hey, baby, is everything fine with you? Please forgive me, but I'm trying not to cry. Oh, I've had a million different offers on the phone, but I just stay right here at home. I don't think that I can take this anymore, this crazy war. Now, when I look at the clouds across the moon, in the night I just hope and pray that soon. Oh, baby, you hurry home to me. to love you, baby. Love 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 to love you, baby. When you're laying so close to me, there's a place I'd rather you be there with me. Here. Do it to me again and again. You put me in such an awful spin and spin.
Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to day 2 of the symposium. Firstly, I would like to acknowledge that we are gathered here today on the unceded lands of the Wurundjeri people, and I pay my respect to elders past and present. And I also acknowledge and respect the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people had and still have laws that predate colonisation, and we join in their responsibility to care for country as built environment and design experts, and thank the traditional owners for sharing their knowledge. My name is Professor Alan Pert, and I'm Deputy Dean of the Faculty of Architecture, Building and Planning, and I'm delighted to welcome you both to our online participants and to everyone who's gathered here at the Edge at Federation Square for day 2 of the Future Design Research Symposium. A huge congratulations to co-conveners Ruckus Hinkle, Leary, Paul Lowe, representing the ADD+F Research Hub, for a hugely successful day yesterday at the School of Design, and to all the panel members for some great conversations and provocations. I'd also like to acknowledge our co-hosts, the Melbourne Graduate School of Education, and note that the symposium is only made possible through the generous support of the Robert Garland Tresidor Fellowship. Bob Tresidor will be joining us throughout the day, and it's wonderful to get that support, and also to acknowledge the Creative Futures Design Research and Education Fund that's also made the symposium possible. The Tresidor Fellow for 2022 is Jenny Wu, co-director of Euler Wu Collaborative and a member of the faculty of the Southern California Institute of Architecture, or SIAC as we typically refer to it. And Jenny delivered the keynote last night at the School of Design as a wrap-up to day 1. And for anyone that saw it, it took us from jewellery to furniture, to toys, to staircases, to tree houses, pavilions, buildings and memorials. So it was a bit of an extravaganza. For anyone who missed it, all of the talks and all of the keynotes are up online already, and today's will be up online as well over the weekend. Now this morning you'll hear from another keynote presentation from Carroll Go-Sam, Senior Lecturer of Indigenous Engagement at the University of Queensland, and Professor Lisa Grocott of Design Education at Monash University. They will discuss what matters in design education now and into the future. Later this morning we also have talks on the topics of creative practice research and its impact across parallel design education disciplines. After lunch there will be further fascinating discussions around design and prototyping and speculation in school-based design education. And to conclude this evening, we have a keynote from our guest professor, Theodore Spiropoulos, towards the uncertainty of certainty. Theo is the director of the Architectural Association's world-renowned design research lab in London and resident artist at Somerset House. The lecture will be followed by a roundtable discussion to conclude the symposium with Theodore and academics from ABP, including Professor Helene Frichot, Associate Professor Kate Treglone and Associate Professor Ruckus Hinkle. Thank you all for joining us online and here in person. I'm sure it will be a wonderful day of stimulating and challenging and provocations. And please enjoy the rest of the symposium, and I'll hand over to one of the co-hosts, Leary, to talk you through some of the practical considerations.
Hi everyone. Just a few housekeeping items for today. So to access the full event program, please scan the QR code at the back of your name badge. And for those online, you have it online. Guest Wi-Fi is available for all attendees. Login details are provided at the registration table. Please note that today's event is being filmed and photographed. Video and audio capture may be used for promotional purposes, and if you do not wish to be photographed or filmed, please inform one of our staff members. In case of emergency, exits are located here at the front on both sides, and there is another one on the upper floor on the right. And bathrooms are across the exit on the left corridor. I'll be introducing now our first session. So we have 2 keynote speakers that will be discussing what matters in design, secondary and higher education now and for the future. We have Carroll Gosam, Senior Lecturer in Indigenous Engagement from the University of Queensland there, and we have Professor Lisa Grocott from Monash University Design Education. They will be doing storytelling and moving on to a conversation afterwards. Thank you very much. Please help me welcome them, and thank you very much.
Hello. Thank you. Womanjeka kia ora koutou katoa. Welcome, ko Māori, ko Ingari, whakapapa rangamai. Ingari, ko Maunganui, te monga, ko Waikato te awa, ko Takatimu te waka, ko Dati ka hanunu na iwi, ko Nam te kaina, ko Aotearoa te tūranga waiwai. Thank you, Alan, Larry, co-conveners, for the invitation, and Carroll for the opportunity to share the stage with you. I also extend my respect to my whakapapa in Aotearoa, New Zealand. From my perspective, when it comes to talking about the future of design education, it's always going to be humbling, is this echoing too much, to begin with respecting the embodied wisdom of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders. I recently finished a book that tried to trace connections between neuroscience, memory traces, and designing learning encounters, and it was all a personal revelation to me. But you obviously only need to look at Aboriginal songlines to realise that long before colonial settlers arrived, First Nations people knew that embodied creative practices were the key to robust, sophisticated knowledge systems. And it's this disconnect between thinking that seems new to me and yet ancient knowing to others sets up the story that I want to share with you today. So this is a 3-act story set in Aotearoa more than 30 years ago, but hopefully it will still resonate with you today. It is 1991. I'm an undergrad design student in New Zealand on a Māori scholarship. I basically still look the same, no less white than I do today, just more blonde, if anything. And the story begins with me walking into a Māori professor's office. I am coming to ask him questions about this visual dictionary of Māori symbols that I plan on designing for my thesis project. I believe this dictionary can help avert disrespectful cultural appropriation. So I misguidedly enter the room, assured that my ideas of how to categorise knowledge into tidy boxes would serve Māori and impress this professor. I remember my frustration as the elder told me stories for the full hour that we were together. I recall my discomfort with his parable about grandchildren looking for answers in the wrong places. I wanted him to get to the point. I wanted him to give me the information that I was looking for, while realising on some felt level that these anecdotes were the point, that the grandchildren who did not deserve to wear a feather coat, they were me. Oh, what did I just do? Press the wrong thing. So my Eurocentric education struggled to see these stories as anything more than obtuse at the time. There was a kind of cognitive dissonance that came with the idea that I was asking a teacher something and they were ignoring my questions. Jack Mesereau would call this a disorienting dilemma. Yet I was also a child raised on Māori fables, and there was a part of me that recognised that these seemingly tangential stories were not vectors into nowhere, but traces of inquiry, curving inwards. If only I could decode his anecdotes, then perhaps I could feel my way towards questions I hadn't even yet begun to grasp. Decades later, luckily, I don't recognise my 21-year-old self. It's hard to believe there was ever a time that I thought that knowledge, ownership and respect were not entangled. Yet the way I walked through the world was not, of course, undone by one office hour visit. Sure, I was disoriented, I was unsettled, but I was not transformed. If this story follows a hero's journey, this is the act where I somewhat reluctantly depart the land that I know and in search to explore unknown territory. Maybe I was at least ready to take flight. So in this new land, I kept attending studio. I obviously escalated the arguments with my thesis supervisor, but now I also had a new teacher. So with my kaumatua, Jonathan Mane Fioki, teaching me new ways of being held to account, I got to spend days in parallel learning spaces. If it felt like extra work to spend weekends on the marae discovering new ways of gathering and learning, I don't remember it that way. Over this time, I also began recalling my 9-year-old self watching my great-great-aunt, Whina Cooper, on TV. At 79 years old, Whina began walking with her mokopuna to the nation's capital, 1,000 kilometres away. The primary aim of this month-long hikoi, the march, was to protest against the continuing loss of Māori land. Joined by more than 40,000 along the way, this historic walk became known as the Māori Land March and forever changed Aotearoa's history. No doubt having a celebrity relative shaped my relationship with identifying as Māori, but my 9-year-old self also remembers watching Whina on TV, knowing that I would never be walking beside her because my great-great-grandmother had been sent away from a marae to live with Pākehā, and any lived connection I had to Māori whakapapa was gently yet violently diminished with every generation. So I quickly grasped the idea, right, that I had no right to make this visual dictionary. It was clearly a blatantly colonial project from the outset, and I needed a new thesis project. But I had a really narrow understanding of design, so I definitely would have thought of myself as a maker of things in this solution-focused, tangible space. So it seemed like my first challenge in this new land was even just to question whether designing an artefact was what was called for. As an activist, Whina had seeded a Māori renaissance without designing any tangible solution. She had embodied change and brought people along the journey with her. That year, my Māori elders, my whakapapa, and the community around me offered a way of reframing what design could be. So my thesis project ended up being an inquisitive process for designers to consult with Māori and to question their own worldviews. With a sense of purpose, I had come to understand design as a process of making meaning. That project no doubt seeded my relational and participatory values that I hold today about design. Yet, predictably, my examiners had not gone on the same journey, or I had failed to bring them along with me. And what would be a hero's journey without some conflict, right? So fixed in their understanding of what making was, they reached the consensus quickly that I had made nothing. They concluded that I should fail. Luckily, this was back in the 90s, even back in the 90s, this university policy had anticipated this kind of blindness, and my Māori mentor, Jonathan Mane Fioki, was allowed to be in the examination room that day. And with the university's commitment to the Treaty of Waitangi to back him up, Jonathan was already prepared for this fight, and he pushed back. Just because they couldn't see what I had made, it didn't mean that I wasn't making possible a different way of practicing design. In the year when I had learnt the most invaluable of lessons, my institution begrudgingly gave me a C. Yet, of course, the lessons did not end there. Predictably, decades of Western education would not be undone by 1 year of adjacent Indigenous lessons. Some forms of unlearning and rehearsing new ways of being are obviously going to be a lifelong project. So soon after graduating, I am again in a Māori community, this time learning te reo in a continuing Māori education language class in small-town New Zealand. For 30 years, I have told the story of how in this humble prefab space, with just one statement, a fellow student forever shifted how I think of learning. I don't recall his name. I'm not even convinced that I would be able to pick him out of a crowd, but I have come to call this fellow student Tama. But first, some backstory. This was a total immersion Māori language class. You weren't allowed to speak English from the first day we arrived. And we worked through the content at the pace of the slowest person in your learning group. I was a fast learner. I was frustrated. I wanted to move. up to another group because I had a sense of being held back by how so slow some people were in the group. So here I was to learn my ancestors' language, and yet my colonised mind was totally taking up space like an entitled white person. So, cut to the end of the week. It's the only time we're allowed to speak English, and we're sitting in a circle, and everyone's sharing why they came to be in this class. And Tama is one of the last to speak on this Friday afternoon. He tells his story, but then he also wants to thank his group for our patience. He shared how, as a kid, he was always the kid in the back row. He was always lost. He could never keep up. He left school the day he turned 15. He told us that he knew that he was slow and it meant everything that we were not moving on without him. And he could see that people in his group were frustrated. He promised us he was trying his hardest. As he expressed his gratitude, he choked up and he smiled. And he said, "I have never before known the feeling of not being left behind." As I listened to Tama, I felt shame, guilt, complicit, ignorant, humbled, but I also, in a moment, felt changed by the space his vulnerability created. The very next week, everything shifted, not just for me, for him, for our whole group. We were no longer individuals floating through a learning experience. We were a team, and we all wanted to be by Tama's side. I kind of experienced it that Friday afternoon as like a cognitive shift, just an intellectual critique of a meritocratic education system that had served the likes of me while failing so many others. As I watched our small group pivot into advancing the whole group's learning, I saw Tama begin to grasp in 30 minutes things that had taken 2 hours when he felt the pressure of trying to perform. No one was bored, there was lots of high fives. We were deeply invested in our collective success. I was soon to go on to become a design educator, and my commitment to peer-led, student-centred approach to learning obviously came from that experience. And yet every time I revisit this story, I peel back more layers. I now understand that how I teach and how I design were shaped more by that 1 month in small-town Aotearoa than in the world-class universities I've had the privilege to study and work in. The vulnerability that comes with embodied play reminds me not just of my years at Parsons, but also of the kapahaka and the waiata that we danced as part of that program. The invitation of co-design seems intrinsically linked to learning in a social context where cues and ear rods, do you have those in Australia, those like coloured things for learning maths, were the only material for collaborative sense-making. The call to design more equitable futures is informed by how I saw the co-constructed play allowed the structural racism, the cultural richness, and the liberatory feeling of learning a language your parents were forbidden to speak take up space in that prefab classroom. 30 years ago, I absolutely believed that lining up for 40 minutes at the beginning of each day to hongi every person in the program was just lost learning time. However, the relational orientation of my practice today would always see me making space for belonging as essential for any deep learning encounter. If I were to see this stay with Joseph Campbell's hero's journey, this would be the third act. It would represent my return. The transformation story would conclude with the lessons I had learned, with a bright future paved before me. But it is not clear what I am returning to. The pull of the kind of dominant, colonial, patriarchal, consumerist, fill in whatever scripts that you want, have persistently had me erase or dismiss many of the Indigenous lessons of my youth. It is only in getting curious about what beliefs I need to unsettle and in resisting the norms of how I'm supposed to show up, even as a design academic, that I can see how the lessons from my kamatoa and my whakapapa, my elders and my ancestors, were always right in front of me. The meta lesson here is that the hard work if dismantling enculturated worldviews and constraining norms does not happen on some blank future laid out in front of us. Many Indigenous cultures offer a different perspective of how we might position ourselves in relation to the past and the future. When I first heard the Mayan worldview that the future is behind us and the past is what laid out in front of us, I felt what my colleague Dion Tucker would call an exquisite disorientation. I felt an embodied sense of how tightly we hold on to a modernist script that the future is some possibility-filled blank slate. If we seek to imagine a new future of design education for the planet, for ourselves, we need to explore what might come from the past. It's not something that is just over our shoulder, but what we are walking toward. I would audaciously argue that we need education experiences that are transformative. Most learning experiences are instead assimilative, conceived to introduce new information without challenging existing belief systems. Transformative learning, in contrast, calls for shifting perspectives, interrogating worldviews, and of course, questioning your assumptions. I've shared my lived experience, but neuroscience, social psychology, and millennia of Indigenous knowing affirm that transformative learning needs to be social, novel, disorienting, embodied, and of course, reflective. Indigenous perspectives help underscore that transformation does not follow some kind of teleological path. We can use the creative, critical, collaborative orientation of design to find novel ways to sidle up to the past so that we can get curious how to design more equitable futures. Or to say something that feels somewhat, I don't know why I say somewhat, feels very transgressive in a room with lots of architects. We need learning that calls for our whole selves to turn up, just as Tama did that Friday afternoon 30 years ago. Thank you. In the spirit of making a case for transformative learning and knowing that some of you are sitting here for a long day today, we decided that we would resist the idea of having Q&A sessions and that we would intersperse moments for you to talk to each other. But we are running a little late, so we're going to do a different option. So for those of you online, you can type this into Slido and share with each other if you want. And for the people in the room, you could obviously do it on Slido, or you can just do this into your phones. But the things that Carroll and I have been talking about in setting this up today is to both reflect on the world that we feel like we're in now, and then also at the end of the session we're going to create space for you all to collectively be reflecting on the worlds that might be possible. So our invitation before Carroll shares her story is just to take 1 minute to choose one of these worlds and fill in the blank. To think about, so you could think of this, it's not very social because we're not going to get you to talk to each other, we were going to, but just to at least be reflective and pause for a second and just think about what this is. And I'm just going to give you 1 minute to do that, and then Carroll is going to share her story. You can ask yourself, obviously, who the people are. Does the second part, the blank part of the sentence change if it's the learner versus the teacher versus the educator or the public? or Indigenous peoples.
All this confusion, it's just an illusion.
All right, just give you another 10 seconds and then I'll hand over to Carroll.
In all this confusion, it's just an illusion.
So I think our 10 seconds is up. Thank you for participating in that, and let's hope that that continues. And I guess my story is speaking to Indigenous diversities too. So Lisa's experience in Aotearoa is very different to my experience and the family oral stories and histories that were handed down to me. So I've just started with this slide because this is the Millstream camp, and the Millstream camp is where my grandmother lived and my aunties and uncles some of them were born. And this is in Jiribal country, on Gumbalbara country too. Gumbalbara means rocky place, even though each of it is distinguished from the two main spaces in which Jiribal people divide their world into, the rocky place and the grassy plains, Yabulambara. So my association starts with there. So this slide is very interesting too because it's taken in around circa 1936. So it's just after what we call the killing times, or my grandmother called the cruel times. And the auntie whose house I'm going to show as a way of me thinking about architecture and why my personal journey came to architecture, it was about trying to essentially find a better solution for Indigenous housing. And it's been a consistent theme throughout my experience at university, prior to university, and to the present in the research that I do. So I hope you'll stick with me with this personal narrative, but perhaps it'll reveal a different dimension of Indigenous diversity that you may not be aware of. So this is my auntie's house. My auntie, she lives at a place called Wandekla on Gumbalbara country. The house that you see is the pimped up version of her house. So imagine her house from that front elevation about half. So the version that I used to visit as a child into my teens is about half the size of the house that you see there. And so this house is built near a place called Nigger Creek. And so I've recently just written an architectural narrative and experience of first visiting this house when it was built in the 1970s. So this was the way that my family were able to partially access housing, but mostly within my family, it was access to rental properties that were perhaps discarded and not fit for non-Indigenous people, but very fit for Indigenous people. So my auntie and uncle acquired this piece of land in Herberton, and it's actually not a freehold land, it was a mining property, it was a mining lease, and for $5 in the 1970s. So my uncle set up a mining lease and a fake well to pretend he was actually mining, but essentially he wanted land to build a house. And so it is about a 2-minute walk to Nigger Creek. So that just gives you the context of the environment that I grew up in. There are actually 10 Nigger Creeks in North Queensland, Nigger Mountain, and this creek is actually a traditional camping place. It belongs to my great-grandfather. And our family have been able to, thankfully, live and maintain connection to country. But when I entered architecture, I remember in first year, there was a different type of housing that I was exposed to, which I had in my sort of very small world in North Queensland. I never knew houses like this existed in the world. And actually, when I first saw it, I thought it was a museum or in this beautiful setting and surrounding, which seemed to actually really have lots of relationships with the country that I was familiar with, lots of fresh water, rainforests, trees, but that was a very different type of housing. And this, I guess, when I first did the first 3 years of architecture, I had this great ambiguity about whether or not architecture was going to be the solution for Aboriginal housing that I sought, because I thought that's not the sort of housing that my family can access. We want functional, a very sort of practical approach to housing, but also something that fit the cultural framework and sociality of Indigenous households. So I grew up in a multi-generational, multi-family household, as did my entire family. There was no one I knew who lived alone in any sort of age group. So, the ambiguity for those first 3 years of architecture were incredibly prevalent, and I actually thought I'd made a mistake in enrolling in architecture, that there should be another way into solutioning and acquiring the skills that I needed to have an affordance in and a credibility within the non-Indigenous world, which was most Indigenous people were excluded in having a voice because they didn't hold degrees, they didn't speak the language of the power structures that made lots of decisions about Indigenous people's lives. So, and thankfully, after my year out, I worked in Central Australia for a really vibrant Indigenous organisation called Tangentyere Council, which was a housing organisation, and it started with essentially acquiring leasehold land for what were called at that time town camps. And Tangentyere Council had 18 town camps when I was working for them. They also had an architectural division which had a history of working with architects who were working in the social housing space, but actually working with a tighter cultural fit with Indigenous people. Then suddenly I was revitalised. I thought maybe architecture can offer a solution to the very thing that I was hoping to attain from my education. So also working in Central Australia, I saw that similar Indigenous people had similar struggles in terms of access to housing. The image that you see with the man going in front of the wheelchair is from the 1970s. It was an architect called Peter Hamilton from the University of Sydney. He lived and worked with the Yunkajanjara and Anangu Pitjantjatjara peoples on their country for 18 months with his wife, who was an anthropologist. And I was able to have a dialogue with him and get him to share this incredible, rich repository of work from his fieldwork, which he never completed. He never completed his PhD, and he minimally published. So that's the. So it wasn't just, he's an interesting man and an interesting story. He found commune living, I think, much more afforded to his worldview. But on the left to my left and your right is the image of Paul Folleris's Indigenous housing design. I was able to critique that and understand, because some of the, obviously Indigenous people do share similar belief systems, and why this housing and this thoughtful and well-considered housing failed failed dramatically and miserably and was a poor cultural fit because it was about introducing a technology and a way of seeing their world, the Yankunytjatjara world, but after all this really careful, thoughtful, consultative work over a period of many years, this housing failed, and it had to be retrofitted to actually fit Indigenous ways of living and operating. So it started within myself a whole set of questions. But then I also, through my university, going back and being inspired to complete fourth and fifth year in the bachelor's at the time, it was called a bachelor's program, I came across self-constructed housing. And it was very different to it was very similar to the bush camps that my uncle had built. He maybe built a smaller scale version of what you see here on the screen. But this was the housing that Indigenous people built for their multi-family, multi-generational households, which were very tight, sort of tightly knit, you know, what most people would think of as nuclear families. So I felt re-inspired about architecture, that maybe architecture could perhaps be the medium in which we could sort of then shift and change the social housing construct that has very much limited the agency of Indigenous people and open up this world. So I think we're going to, I've just sped through that a little bit, but I just think that gives you a framework that when we're thinking about architecture is the solution, sometimes it's not the solution, because if the social aspect of actually dealing and understanding people's lives and the disruption that we're causing through what we're introducing with technology, then there is always going to be a misfit. And, you know, if we think we have a solution, we often don't, because we haven't really fully understand the social construct. So in this sort of great pursuit for technology and all the things that it affords us as a research, you know, field for mining, we need to really carefully consider about the social world.
I still think we can talk a little more before I don't see the audience jumping up and down saying, yes, let us talk amongst ourselves yet. I think, to me, we've had a few conversations before today, and, you know, one of the things that we've liked, I guess, right, is that our stories feel so almost opposite, right, in many different ways, that particularly our experiences of going into an institution and then coming out in the places we work in now. But the thread is also this sort of co-design or participatory orientation, right, of to know that world that you're describing. And one of the things we've really kind of wrestled with is the challenge of doing that, like when your perspective or your worldview is so other to the space that you might be designing into. I just wondered if you wanted to talk more about what that's been like when you've gone, you know, into spaces, and, you know, what that, in an ideal world, what might that co-creative space look like, or even the expertise issue, right, of the people that get excluded because of not having credentials, etc.
Yes, I know that, you know, there is a lot of, I guess, discussion and advocacy around co-design. And what does actually co-design mean, you know? And because architecture is so much about the reputation that comes from the work that is built on each project, right? And so when you co-design, you have to really let go of your way of doing things and practicing to produce something that has an outcome that shifts away from that. You have to lessen your power and your own agency in that. And I think that in something like housing, which is so incredibly personal, but in social housing, the social housing process, as an example, strips away the agency of the recipient and gives the agency to the providers. And that's the way of controlling the product, controlling the budget and so forth. And in many ways, the sort of spaces that we design, I work at a university, as most of us probably do, and I was really surprised to find out that most of the buildings at UQ and probably most campuses don't actually engage with the users. And I find this a bizarre and strange concept that we have the designer as the knower, and the knower of every user and every user's needs, but that we're just creating a space in which we assume everyone will be comfortably inhabited. They will sort of, it will function perfectly. But this space itself is a demonstration that sometimes all of those aspirations and that assumption of knowing sometimes doesn't even meet the practicality of light streaming in onto this large screen and you not being able to see it. So I think that there's lots of questions that we need to ask ourselves about what is the education process, what is the design that we're creating, and what is it impact, not only in terms of its practical usability, but how do people socially relate to that?
Yeah, I think that one of the words that I often have pushed back to me when I would describe co-design was this sort of idea of like, where is the authority of the designer? You know, like the sense of just giving up too much. And that seems to me like you've got authority at one end, right, of how do we hold on to that, what does that look like? And then you've got this, you know, agency for the people that might be living in these spaces. Or, you know, if I think of those examiners even 30 years ago, I think they didn't use that language, but I think it was a similar thing, right? That if what I was sharing as an outcome of my research was a process and a way of being, you know, working in a more participatory way, not that I used that term at the time, yeah, all they saw was that I just hadn't designed something, that the expertise I'd had that had given me straight A's until that day weren't being deployed here. I was doing something else and they didn't know how to examine that, they didn't know what that looked like, and it feels like it's a broadly, like architecture and design, you know, I think really embrace this idea of stepping outside of their worlds and is sort of not being constrained by the artifact or the, you know, so whether that's going into urban spaces or experience and service design, and yet at the same time, I wonder how much that worldview shifts of the sort of ego part you're describing, right, of like what it really means to give agency to the people who might be experiencing it, and the tension of what is our role in that, you know, when that happens. Yeah. One of my colleagues, Sonali Ohad, worked a lot with street children in Mumbai, so children that had never been housed in their lives. And I was sort of saying, oh, well, you know, obviously you're just designing for agency. Don't know if I said obviously, but, you know, like I was sort of like, thought I was putting language to what she was doing. And she said, well, designing for agency is the easy part. And then she said, it's like, you can't design for agency without actually building trust. And you can't kind of build trust without getting people to share their hopes. And you can't get people to share their hopes unless they can share their fears. And it was just such an interesting way for me to kind of understand that this kind of notion that through participation or something you could be granting agency, if we don't have ways of really understanding that social space, listening to the, you know, day-to-day kind of worlds that people are living in, and if those worlds are so other to our own, you know, how do we kind of access that and make sense of it? Yeah. We have, the clock says we've got 3 minutes and 50 seconds left. The invitation here, should we do this? The invitation here was to get away from the idea that, you know, you're passively listening to people today, and to think of a way for you to at least internalise some of what we're talking about and what that means for your practice. And so for the people in the room, if you are sitting by yourself, I would invite you to stand up and go and sit beside someone else with the full knowledge that when I was told to do that in church as a young child on Christmas Day, I hated the idea. But you're going to be brave and you're going to try this out. For the people online, again, you could just write. But again, the invitation is to take one of these. As you see in my notes above, it says turn to your neighbour and babble. The point of that is that this doesn't need to be a really thoughtful, coherent comment, right? It's almost like just speaking off the top of what you've just heard. What are the implications of this? What could this mean for you? And we will give you 2 minutes. So that's like 1 minute per person. So even if you're in groups of 3, you're going to have to split up. Okay? 1 minute one person, 1 minute the next person. Starting now.
Sunshine when she's gone, ain't no warm when she's away, ain't no sunshine when she's gone, she's always gone too long, anytime she goes away, and no wonder where she's gone. Wonder where she's gonna stay, and I wonder where she's gone, always gone along, anytime.
Okay, if you haven't switched, now the other person gets to babble.
Morning. Lillian, I believe.
All right. We might bring you back from your conversations. Hopefully the invitation is that you at least began to see what was being unsettled for you and the potential implications for your future practice, right? How this might change the roles that you play. And now we're being told that our time is up. You can continue these conversations over morning tea.
Thank you, Carol, and thank you, Lisa, for sharing your stories. I just said I almost cried when you told your story, but that person really appreciated being not left behind. I think it's like really deeply touching. And I invite you all to keep talking and not interrupt you. And there's morning tea at the back of the foyer, and at 10:15 we start our second session, which is Creative Practice Research and its Messy Methods. Thank you.
Anytime she goes away, anytime